All right, everybody, coming to you semi-live from my bed. For those of you who don't know, I've recently had a knee replacement surgery, so I'm still recording episodes from my bed where all three of my children were conceived. So that's a unique perspective from a podcast. But today we have a very special guest from the state of Wyoming, Mr. Justin Binfet. Justin, how we doing, man?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Doing good. What's April and May like in Wyoming as far as weather is concerned?
Well, that depends on the year because this year it's downright depressing, to be honest with you. We have slipped into not just drought, but extraordinary drought.
Yeah.
Was without a doubt the driest winter and really spring now that anyone can remember. And if you go back and actually look at some weather data, it's as dry as it's ever been
Yeah.
in recent memory.
Yeah. Here's the thing about the West. Like, I've heard that for I don't even know how many years, right? And I get that there's certain parts of the West, especially eastern Wyoming, into the Dakotas, down into western Nebraska and things like that, where it's an arid environment where it doesn't get as much rain as, other parts of the state. So when you guys have had, when you hear the buzzword drought for so long, what's that actually mean to someone who doesn't live there?
Well, I can tell you in some cases, I think it gets a little overused in terms of how it relates to wildlife.
Yeah.
But Wyoming actually gets a pretty fair amount of of precipitation compared to a lot of other western states, say like Utah or Nevada
Mm-hmm.
or Idaho even. We get the bulk of our moisture comes in those months of March, April, May, June. That's what's really important. And it really depends on the year. So if you rewind the clock just a few years ago, coming out of that really nasty 22-23 winter that a lot of your
Mm-hmm.
listeners may be aware of, I mean, we had an extraordinarily wet, heavy snow winter, really wet spring all the way through the summer. So that, the implications of that are huge with
Mm-hmm.
wildlife. When you have a couple of really good wet years and then you couple that with, say, like a mild winter, we can grow deer and antelope populations like crazy.
Yeah.
Coming out of that 22-23 winter, and then the next year was also a fairly wet spring and summer. We had 2 years of some of the highest fawn production we've ever recorded in a lot of the state in both deer and antelope populations. You fast forward a couple years later to this year. Now it'll remain to be seen how the rest of the spring shakes out and the summer and that sort of thing as far as how that impacts fawn production. But if you rewind the clock to, say, some of those years like the early 2000s where we had 6 consecutive years of extreme drought conditions,
Mm-hmm.
the fawn productions, we measure fawn production in terms of ratios. So how many, say, fawns per 100 does. We'll just use antelope as an example. In those really dry years, a fawn ratio might be in the 40s or low 50s per every 100 does. And if you get a really good wet year, or a couple wet years in a row where animals are coming out of the winter in pretty good shape, and then you have a lot of groceries on the ground for lactating females and things like that, those same fawn ratios might get in the 80s and 90s, and in extreme cases even low 100s per 100 does. So the
Yeah.
point I'm trying to make is that weather in Wyoming in particular, but I mean this is common everywhere, when you have these fluctuations between drought and wet years and everything in between, weather is absolutely the biggest driver of those populations in Wyoming.
Yeah. Okay. So because I've also heard about winter kill, right? In the state of Wyoming, especially kind of revolving around mule deer, per se. And so talk to me about what happens when maybe you go in, like when you go from a winter kill scenario where the winter and snowpack affects how deer move and feed, versus then coming into a drought scenario for the next year like that.
So it's really is what it is. It's all about the nutritional condition of adult females.
Okay.
And we'll use, excuse me, sorry. We'll use mule deer and pronghorn interchangeably here. So when you have in Wyoming, we do get some really wet, nasty, cold winters. The 22-23 winter, 2016-17 winter, and parts of the state, the 2019-20 winter were really tough. So when you have those really severe winters where you have a lot of snowpack coupled with cold temperatures, you get like a crusting layer on the snow that can form, it can form an ice layer. It can be really hard for those animals to then I just energetically move through the snow. That takes a ton of just, you're burning a ton of calories just to survive and move, much less to access the
Yeah.
forage. So if you have a winter like that, you can just have direct mortality. That 22-23 winter where we have a bunch of animals collared in western Wyoming, like our famed Wyoming range mule deer herd, we literally lost 2/3 of that herd. It was 100% fawn loss. Every single fawn we had collared that winter died. And then
Yeah.
of the adults, we actually lost over 70% of our collared adults. That's a really extreme situation. But is what that does is then you have a lot less mouths on the ground following that. That was followed by a really wet spring and summer. We had poor fawn production that year because what females survived came out of that in really poor shape. I mean, you've been
Yeah.
laying on your bed for a couple months, right? And so, like, if you were bedridden for a long time and you had muscle atrophy or whatever it may be, and you're coming out of that, and it's going to take you a while to build your reserves back up to get back in shape. And so
Right.
so there's often a lag effect. So as these animals come out of that winter, what survived, they're bare, like the fawn production, those fawns that were born that year, almost there was very little survival there. But then that wet year, they were able to actually put a lot of fat back on their backs throughout that summer. And then going into the next year, which happened also be a mild winter, overwinter survival was excellent. And then they come out of that winter in really, really good shape. We saw some of the biggest fawns ever born. There's a long-term research project, I should say. So really, really hefty fawns born in really good shape. And then that's what led to that really good fawn production in 2024. And then that followed with another year of really good fawn production because those females entered that winter again in really good nutritional condition. The reverse is when you have really dry conditions that stack up successively, those females they're really scrounging for the adequate nutrition just to raise those fawns to the age of recruitment through the energetic demands of summer lactation, etc. They then will then enter a winter in pretty poor shape, which then even a moderate winter, much less a severe winter, can reduce the survival of those adult females and or impact the birth weights and the nutritional health of those fawns born the following year. So the
Okay.
point, that's a long rambling answer, Dan, but the point is like those effects can compound each other. And if in Wyoming in particular, where you do have those bigger fluctuations, uh, you can see periods of really good population growth or really stagnant population suppression,
Yeah.
depending on whether we're in a drought or a wet cycle.
Yeah. Okay. And this is awesome because this is going to lead right into one of the other topics. But before we get into the rest of this conversation, I want to send a huge shout out to some of the partners of this podcast. Montana Decoy. If you're trying to get inside that quote unquote kill range of an antelope, an elk, a mule deer, a whitetail, go check out montanadecoy.com and take a look at all their very lightweight packable decoys. Next on the list is Wasp Archery. In my opinion, some of the best broadheads on the market. Most of their heads are still manufactured in the United States, and they have just badass designs from a mechanical standpoint or a fixed blade, whatever you like. And they have most of their materials also created in the United States. So go check out wasparchery.com, discount code NFC20 for 20% off. All right. Had to pay the bills there. Okay. So as we start, as we start to talk about mortality, we start to talk about good years and bad years in fawn production, right? Then we have to start to forecast what the deer herd is going to look like in the upcoming seasons or things like that. How does that then, the impact of those studies, like you said, 2/3 of a particular mule deer um, herd was lost. And in those zones, then, how do you guys adjust tag allocations or know how many tags to give out for residents and non-residents?
Well, yeah, and we're certainly blessed right now with we've got a lot of research projects going on around the state, but we certainly don't have collared animals in every herd for every
Mm-hmm.
species. In fact, most herds do not have those, but we are we have better science to drive that decision making than we've ever had before. We've gotten better at estimating our populations. We have a lot more intensive aerial survey campaigns going on. So the point I'm trying to make is between technological advances, some of the research that we have going on out there with collared animals, knowing what survival rates are, and then our population estimation techniques, we've just gotten better and better about estimating populations. So had that being said, we keep a close eye on all of our herds, and when we do have these really big changes, that's just something we evaluate. That's just part of what we do. It's what our wildlife biologists spend a significant portion of their entire winter is compiling data, analyzing it, formulating reports, and then estimating those populations and ultimately providing a season recommendation. And so in those cases, and those recommendations come out in the spring, but in cases like your example where we did have big winter losses, it depends on the species. So, I mean, we get more conservative because we have to. We have less animals out there on the landscape, and we certainly have some expectations from the public of still maintaining a quality hunt. But in the case of antelope, everything in the state of Wyoming is limited quota. So that means there's a set number of licenses for a given hunt area. Some of your listeners might call it a unit or whatever, but for a given hunt area. And then our licenses are a mix of any antelope or these doe fawn licenses. So when we have to be more conservative, we reduce or entirely eliminate the doe fawn licenses and then reduce those number of buck tags or those any antelope licenses. With deer, we kind of have a mix of what we call general licenses, which are unlimited over-the-counter licenses for residents, and then non-residents they're limited, but they can hunt any area within a region that is open to a general license, but there is a limited number of those available. In those cases, when we need to reduce pressure, and with mule deer in the vast majority of our areas, we're only harvesting buck mule deer anyway. They're already incredibly conservative seasons with little or no doe harvest in the vast majority of the state. So if we need to get more conservative there because we have less animals, really the main things we'll do are shorten season length. In some cases, we'll add antler point restrictions if we really need to reduce harvest on that younger segment of the bucks. I should put a note in there that we only like to run those for a couple, 2-3 years at a time and then remove them. We can get into that later if you want. And then we can reduce the number of non-resident licenses. So
Okay.
those are the three main tools there. And then in our limited quota mule deer hunts, just like antelope, we just reduce the number of licenses.
Gotcha. So I know I know this because I have I saw it on social media this morning as I was doing a little scrolling.
So
Um,
it must be true, right?
yeah, exactly. So it's got to be true.
Got to be
But
true.
there are critics out there who think that for some reason that antler point restrictions don't work on mule deer populations like they work on whitetail populations on the east. Like, for example, in the state of Michigan, and there's a group of counties in Michigan where antler point restrictions has increased the antler size and age class of that deer herd for bucks specifically. And then there's some people out there who don't necessarily agree with antler point restrictions on the mule deer herd. What what would your feedback be to comments like that?
Well, so in Wyoming, we don't ever use antler point restrictions in our whitetail populations. So
Okay.
we don't have any data to really even reference there.
Yeah.
With respect to mule deer, though, antler point restrictions do, and I want to be very clear about this. Antler point restrictions do absolutely nothing for the overall trajectory of that herd or that population. We're only
Okay.
talking about male harvest management here.
Okay.
Some people think we need to put those on just to help the deer herd recover and grow. We hear that all the time.
Yeah.
It does nothing for that. Is what it can do is it can reduce harvest pressure on your younger age class of bucks, but even that can depend on the configuration with which we implement those. We have some that are 3 point or better seasons, some that are 4 point or better seasons. So it can do that. Um, in a lot of cases where we get kind of politically forced to put those on because of public demand, in some cases we don't even really need them. Like
Hmm.
when we have antler point restrictions in, like, say, big mountain country, the very few people harvest yearling buck deer anyway. Like, say, in the Wyoming range, right? You're not really hiking up to 11,000 feet above timberline to shoot a little 2 point
Right.
deer.
Right.
I mean, so in some cases they're kind of a more feel good thing. In other cases, they do provide a meaningful reduction of yearling buck harvest. Maybe in that same herd, like some mule deer that are down low, where folks hunting the low elevation country have access to them. You might save some yearling bucks. In places like central Wyoming, where you have a bunch of public land but low elevation, kind of more rolling, broken mule deer country, there we in a general season we might see a pretty high percentage of harvest on those yearling bucks. So
Yeah.
an antler point restriction can save some, and it can also reduce participation because some people don't like them. So in it's not it doesn't hold as true as it used to, but in the past, when we would have antler point restrictions, a lot of hunters would just elect to hunt another area.
Hmm.
Because contrary to popular opinion, not every mule deer hunter cares about harvesting a big buck deer. In fact, the vast majority of folks just want to go out and just hunt, and they're happy to harvest any legal buck.
Yeah.
So then the last thing, and probably the most important thing that I need to say, is that when you run antler point restrictions consecutively for year in and year out, is what it can do is over the long term, it can just shift all of your harvest pressure on your older segment of bucks. And as hunters become accustomed to that's the only legal deer, you can actually reduce the age structure of your mature buck population. While you might
Interesting.
have more bucks that live to be 2 and 3 years old, you're actually harvesting a much higher percentage of your 4 and 5 year old bucks with that. So really, and this is not a lesson just learned in Wyoming. This is learned throughout the West. I mean, any Western state game and fish agency will tell you the same thing. And so really the best way to run those is to run them for 2 or 3 years at a time. And then hopefully you get some response. You can increase your buck ratios in the short term, but then you want to spread that buck harvest pressure out across all segments of the male population.
Gotcha. Okay. You mentioned something there that was very interesting to me. And you said something along the lines of like rules and regulations getting influenced by social pressure and not necessarily science driven data. Okay. How does someone in you first off, I think we need to take a backward step here. What is your position within the state of Wyoming? What's your title?
Well, so I am the deputy chief of our wildlife division. And I guess I wear a lot of hats in the agency, but I came up through the ranks as a district wildlife biologist and then a regional wildlife coordinator. Every state has kind of different titles and a little bit different, I guess, chain of command, if you will.
Hmm.
But um, so I've been dealing with setting hunting seasons my entire career. And then for Wyoming, I'm certainly just one piece of our wildlife division administration, but with that, my one of my primary responsibilities is to help steer the season setting process throughout for the entire state.
Okay. And that sounds like it can be complicated because of all the numerous species and the numerous units that Wyoming has.
Oh, you bet. I mean, it's pronghorn, and I use pronghorn antelope interchangeably, but pronghorn, mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk, moose, sheep, goat, bison, turkeys,
Yeah.
all the upland game birds,
Mhm.
small game, you name it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. With that said, then, how does social pressure to change a rule and regulation versus scientific data clash in your eyes?
Well, it's wildlife management 101. When if you go to school to get a degree in wildlife management, anyone with any experience will tell you you spend a lot more time managing people than you do wildlife, and it's
Hmm.
absolutely true. In Wyoming, we pride ourselves. We do we're we we're really, really accessible to the general public. We Wyoming's a pretty small state, the smallest population in the country. So um our public has pretty good access to our folks, and we try really, really hard to listen to public input throughout the entire year. I mean,
Right.
our field folks are out there. We meet with our constituents on a year-round basis, with whether it's landowners, hunters, outfitters in places. I mean, you name it. So you take all that input as we go into our season setting process, and you consider it. Then we come out and have our formal recommendations ultimately formulated based on all the data plus input that's come to us, like from talking to hunters through the fall or meeting
Hmm.
with landowners, whatever. And then we propose our season recommendations. They go out for public comment. We have public meetings around the state. I mean, we'll have public meetings in 37 or so different communities around the state. And then folks can also comment online and that sort of thing. And then we take all that comment back and see what out of that we're going to make changes based on,
Hmm.
and then ultimately present those seasons to the commission. And so, in I would say, we go way more above and beyond like the minimum requirements for public outreach, and it's something we take pretty seriously. Having said that, we can't adopt every solution that everybody wants, right? I
Right.
mean, we'll get
Right.
hundreds and hundreds of comments, and some people are upset because the deer season doesn't open when they have shift work at the mines or something like that. So we can't, we certainly can't in fact, we can't accommodate the majority of the comments we get, but we try hard to do what we can.
Yeah. So recently, I feel like, and when I say recent, I say uh, recently as 5 years. It seems like there's been a vibe in the state of Wyoming where the residents have kind of gotten fed up with I don't know how to put this other than the non-resident. They feeling like they didn't have a voice, or that the non-resident was overtaking their state in certain times of year, or like, hey, I showed up to my favorite trailhead and there's three guys from Wisconsin or Iowa or New York or whatever at my favorite spot or whatever, which has potentially resulted in some new regulations being adopted and or has been adopted. What would your response to that be?
Well, I can't speak to that vibe at all, Dan.
Okay.
I am not a social media guy at all, and to be honest with you, when you do my job, it gets really hard to pay attention to all the different blog, whether it's Monster Muleys or,
Hmm.
Eastman. I mean, there's a ton of different blogs and Facebook forums and things like that. I I try to have an understanding of what's being discussed, but that's about it. And as far
Yeah.
as the vibe that you're talking about, that's I don't think it's not new to Wyoming or not unique to Wyoming. I mean, I think it's emblematic of just uh all the Western states where these residents live there and they get pretty frustrated
Hmm.
if you see a non-resident license plate, whether it's your fishing hole or the trailhead you want to go hunt in.
Yep.
I think that's a pretty common phenomenon. Uh, I would say, and so I don't know that that's changed over time. What has changed is it has that general perception has resulted in some action on the part of our legislature that has made some recent changes. So
What
the
changes
most
specifically if you have any of those?
yeah, so well really there's really only one big example. So our our residency non-residency splits or the allocations in terms of the percentage of licenses that go to a resident versus a non-resident.
Hmm.
Some are set in state regulations, so that means the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission can change those. And then some are set in state statute, meaning that's the law of the state of Wyoming that the state legislature actually sets. And so a few years back, 2023 was the first year our legislature actually enacted a bill that changed the percentages of resident non-resident licenses for our what we call once in a lifetime species. So
Hmm.
for bighorn sheep, mountain goat, moose, and bison, those all changed to 90-10. Prior to that, they were a mix, like moose was 80-20 and sheep and goat were 75-25.
Okay.
So the legislature just made that change a few years ago to 90-10. As far as the percentages for deer, elk, and antelope licenses, those are actually set. They are not in state law, they're in state regulation.
Okay.
And those have not changed for decades and decades. So antelope is an 80-20 split, deer is an 80-20 split, and then elk is an 84-16 split.
Okay. All right. And so when we get some of those changes come through, it's affecting somebody, right? Like maybe the term point creep is for some reason for a non-resident kind of comes into play a little bit
You
where
bet it does. It's a
yeah.
that's a real phenomenon for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And so I look at, and I kind of go back to the COVID years, right? And I kick myself in the ass every single time I start even thinking about this, because the year that I wanted to go, I thought about pulling the trigger on an elk tag in Wyoming. The zone that I wanted to go hunt and that I had the most information on was like 7 points. And now I think it's like 12. Okay. And so I'm just like, dude, I should have pulled the trigger on that unit that year or the following year. So there's 2 years where it was down, and now all of a sudden it's kind of come back up, uh, and done that. Like, how does the state of Wyoming manage the phenomenon point creep, or is it just unmanageable? It is what it is.
Well, there's nothing we really can do to manage it in
Yeah.
terms of all's the only thing we can hope for is that if you go back to the beginning of our conversation is that we get we get several good wet years in a row coupled with some somewhat mild winters, and we can grow populations and then ultimately put more licenses out there.
Yeah.
That's really the only thing we can do. With respect to those once in a lifetime species, when it changed from 90-10, that really did that's a setback to the non-resident allocation. I mean, it cut
Hmm.
it in half essentially. So that absolutely overnight is
Yeah.
going to result in, well, not going to, did result in, major point creep.
Yeah.
With respect to deer, elk, and antelope, um, one of the only other things that we can do, and it wouldn't be our primary motivation, is look at changing management. So, for example, we have a proposal that we're floating out in the southern Bighorn Mountains right now to convert 5 elk hunt areas to from a limited quota framework to a general license. So, unlimited over the counter for residents, and similar to deer, the non-residents now have a region for elk. That may help with
Okay.
some drawing odds there, but the devil will be in the details in terms of how many non-resident region licenses we issue. But we wouldn't make those decisions just based on point creep. I mean, that there's a
Right.
whole long other list of reasons why we would do that.
That change. to me sounds like the elk herd in that region is healthy enough to sustain more hunters. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So while yeah, in recent years, while, you know, I mean, antelope, when conditions are right, we can grow antelope herds uh, pretty pretty quickly.
Yeah.
In recent years, we've had antelope herds have taken a hit, uh, but they're bouncing back, and especially in central and eastern Wyoming, they're bouncing back. Mule deer are on a long, slow, steady decline. We've had a couple of good years with mule
Mhm.
deer in central and eastern Wyoming, so about half our populations have shown some decent growth in the past couple years. Some others that got hit so hard, we're going to be digging out of a hole for several years.
Yeah.
Especially in far western Wyoming. Um, with elk seem kind of impervious to all those weather fluctuations that we talked about. We do see some effects in a really, really consecutive drought years and things like that. But we rarely have significant winter losses for elk. We will in far western Wyoming in a really severe winter. We may lose some calves, but that's about it.
Okay.
Once an elk makes it to adulthood, they just survive. And about the only
Yeah.
thing that gets them is it's either a carnivore somewhere or it's a bullet.
Yeah.
So elk are doing, and I guess that's a long-winded answer to your question, Dan. The point is elk are doing well.
Okay.
And in an awful lot of Wyoming and really the West, they're doing too well. We're way over objective in a lot of our herds.
Okay. That's good. That's a good thing in a way. That means that there's opportunity there for all, resident and non-resident hunters if you're thinking about ever hunting uh, the state of Wyoming.
Yeah, if you look at our mule deer hunting and really antelope too, compared to where we were in the 80s and 90s, I mean, we have cut so much opportunity. These populations aren't as resilient as they used to be. There's large landscape changes. That's a whole you could do hours of a podcast just on all that, right?
Yeah.
But elk are doing well, and so elk have helped close that gap in that loss of deer and antelope opportunity. And really, I mean, it's the age of elk. Elk hunting's never been better.
Okay. That brings up something. Okay. I am a public land hunter whenever I go out west, right? I don't lease, I don't hunt through outfitters. I try to find and do my research on public. How much, and maybe this is kind of alluding to what you just said about how the landscape is changing. How much does agriculture practices affect the wildlife in the state of Wyoming? And maybe we even break it down specifically to cattle grazing and things like grazing rights on certain pieces of public land.
Well, it's a pretty loaded question,
Okay.
and it's a tricky one, right? And the answer is it depends. So,
Okay.
you know, I can tell you, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this first and foremost. Like keeping agriculture on the landscape and working and working ranches surviving is like the number one good thing we can do for wildlife in the West. And I firmly believe that when
And
you
why
look
is
at
that?
because if you look at the amount of just subdivision and habitat fragmentation when ranches split up and they start selling these 40-acre pieces and 10-acre pieces and 5-acre
Understood.
pieces,
Yeah.
you are carving up and fragmenting wildlife habitat. You're compromising whether it's migration corridors, whether just general use. It leads to fences, roads, disturbance, people running around on side by sides, even people with hunting cabins and things like
Hmm.
that. That's all contributing to the fragmentation of wildlife habitat. And in Wyoming, it's coming.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we don't have it to the extent of some of the other Western states, but it's coming. If you look, especially up around Cody, Jackson, Pinedale, Star Valley, Laramie area, our Sheridan area, we are losing wildlife habitat all over the place just simply due to subdivision.
Okay.
So keeping that agriculture on the landscape is so vital for the maintaining of open spaces.
And that's
And
from like a big ranch, like bigger
correct,
thousands of acre ranches.
correct,
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
correct.
Makes sense.
Now, more specific, but then the agriculture practices, that all depends, right? So When if sagebrush grasslands are cultivated and converted, that can be really detrimental to sage grouse.
Hmm.
Okay. But when we have irrigated center pivots with alfalfa, they can be a magnet for deer and antelope and
Hmm.
elk, and even,
Yeah.
um, that can also lead to concentrations of animals that can facilitate disease transmission, like chronic wasting disease. So it's a mixed
Yeah.
bag. More specifically, with your question about grazing, that's also, it depends. Proper livestock grazing is absolutely compatible with wildlife. I mean, Wyoming has been in ranching dominates the land. It's the most prevalent landscape use across the state of Wyoming. Wyoming has some of the most robust wildlife populations in the entire lower 48, and we've had ranching on the landscape for 150 years. So ranching done right absolutely is not only compatible, it's vital for maintaining those wildlife populations. It is
Gotcha.
fair to say, though, when you have really excessive grazing that can result in the degradation of habitats, riparian areas, or whatever, that can have its impacts at a local
Yeah.
level, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And the reason I bring that up is I don't know what kind of feedback you get from hunters, right? And so I'm not knowledgeable about the entire state of. I'm just going to use South Dakota because I've hunted South Dakota for the last 7 years. Because of my knee, I'm not going to hunt it this year. And so one thing that I've noticed over the last 2 years is that the cattle production is up in certain states. And you can even go online and find that. And that means that in order to have more cattle production, you need more cattle on the landscape. And that means more cattle on acres throughout private and public land, where the grazing is. And what I noticed is that where there's cattle, there's not as much mule deer. And that's just because I've been hunting mule deer. What kind of feedback do you get from hunters specifically about that?
You'll see it in the comments,
Yeah.
but it, we don't. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department doesn't manage most wildlife habitat in the state. It's either privately owned, managed by the federal government, the BLM or the
Mhm.
Forest Service or the Park Service, or the state of Wyoming owns a,
Yeah.
a significant amount. We do have a handful of wildlife habitat management areas where Game and Fish owns and manages the land, but it's a really small percentage of the state.
Yeah.
Is so, but people will provide those comments to us, and we will, we understand sometimes where these sentiments come from. We do, we certainly work with our land management agency partners
Hmm.
on a variety of things, and we'll also we also focus a ton of our internal effort on habitat improvement projects across the state. I mean,
Yeah.
between all the different funding sources that we leverage, and folks that we have, like habitat biologists whose sole career is dedicated to facilitating these on the ground habitat improvement projects, that's all they do. And so collectively in the state of Wyoming, tens of millions of dollars get spent every year on habitat restoration work. So that's really where our focus is. But if folks have particular concerns with respect to public land livestock grazing, our recommendation would be is for you to talk to those federal land management agencies.
Yeah.
I can
And
just tell you, sometimes those concerns are absolutely legitimate, and then
mhm,
sometimes maybe they're a little overblown.
blown out. Yeah, I feel that. Some guy pulls up to a side by side, on a side by side, looks into a valley, turns around, says, "Well, all I saw was cattle," right? So I'm going to bitch about it, right? I get that. Um, how
Well, and
do
they may not understand what goes into that landowner or that lessee's grazing rotation. Like, maybe cattle are
100%?
in there that fall, but not the next year. It all depends.
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah.
I feel that. Um, okay, so then you mentioned there's state ground in the state of Wyoming and then there's federal ground. But you guys, does BLM or the Forest Service, they don't manage wildlife. That's still your job, correct?
Correct. They
So,
manage the landscape.
right. So how do you guys work together with Forest Service and BLM or grassland to like discuss wildlife practices and or rules and regulations with that federal entity versus the state entity?
Well, there's just kind of general annual coordination that goes on
Mm-hmm.
every year with their various field offices or ranger districts, depending on the agency. Then, when those agencies, like the Forest Service, will have forest plans that govern how, just from a big picture standpoint, will govern how they manage their lands within that national forest or that ranger district. The BLM has what are called resource management plans, which will govern, and these are multi-decadal documents, like a 20-year plus time frame, where it'll govern their land use planning throughout that entire BLM field office. So when those plans come open for revision, we are certainly one of the cooperating agencies that provides input into those. So that's one of the ways as well. And then, again, it goes back to some of that habitat work too. Our habitat biologists do an excellent job working with those partners on these things, on these projects on an annual basis. So, as an example, you might be out counting sage grouse on a lek one morning and
Yeah.
see a little spot infestation of cheatgrass coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Cheatgrass is like enemy number one uh, to wildlife habitat in the West, and so we see that, and then you might go call up a BLM range con, for example, and hey, I saw this little patch here. Let's make a note of that, and then maybe that'll fold into some future plans to like a where we're going to do some spot treatments to try to treat grass on the landscape. That's just a small example, but that kind of coordination does occur.
Okay.
But it's a monumental challenge, and the dollars only go so far, and we only have so many people to tackle that, and the same with our federal partners.
Yeah. And the term budget comes into, play there as well. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was for a while there, or recently, you guys have made all tag allocations and rules and regulation decisions on an annual basis, correct? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And now there's a proposal, or the proposal has already gone through to do it on a once every 3 year cycle. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we just presented that to our commission this past winter.
Okay.
So our plan is to go to a 3-year season setting cycle starting next year.
Okay.
So we just got done with our season setting process here in late April. That our commission approved all the regulations. So that'll go into effect this fall. Then next year we will do it again in the spring of 2027. And then our intention will be to set those seasons for 3 years at a time. But it's
Okay.
not a done deal. That decision's ultimately up to our commission. So when those seasons get presented to the commission, we will ask them to adopt. Let's just go back to antelope as an example. The antelope hunting seasons for the next 3 years. At
Gotcha.
that point, it'll be the commission's decision whether or not to approve that for 1 year at a time or 3 years at a time.
Okay. So that would just be season dates, or does that also include tag allocations?
Everything. Yep.
Everything. Okay.
So it will be the exact same seasons will remain the same, or
Mhm.
not the exact, the season dates, tag allocations, etc., will remain the exact same everywhere across the state for 3 years at a time.
Gotcha.
Now, is what we will have, because Wyoming is subjected to severe winters periodically. Sometimes severe winters may affect most of the state, all the state, or just a portion of the state. We can also have disease die-offs every now and then. In these drought years, one of the things that we see are outbreaks of epizootic hemorrhagic disease and blue tongue virus. And
Yep.
in some places, that can really, really hammer populations at the local level, especially in our whitetail
Yep.
and our pronghorn. Can be really susceptible. So in the event of a significant die-off, whether it be from disease or more, or severe winter, we will retain the ability to make adjustments to those on an annual basis as needed. We'll just narrowly define where we want to do that. If we go back to the 22-23 winter, it hit a lot of southwest Wyoming and portions of central and south central Wyoming. that's where we would make those adjustments. We wouldn't necessarily throw it open to make adjustments in Northeast Wyoming if we
Yeah.
didn't need to.
So there is still like it's a blanket statement if all things are well, but if there's an emergency, then you guys can step in and course correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, you still have to have the wildlife population's best interest in mind with
Yeah.
all of this.
Yeah.
That's paramount. That's first and foremost.
Yeah. Have you ever ran into a scenario where in your job or in the wildlife biology portion of all this, maybe politics and data, data and science and having the actual, like you mentioned, the best interest for wildlife. Have you ever seen that clash?
Every day I wake up. Yeah, it, I mean, that's just the world we live in.
Give me an example if you can of like, because dude, I am a firm believer that no politician should ever make a rule or regulation about wildlife.
well, is where it clashes the most. I mean, there are some times where you do get influential people that maybe have an outsized influence on how a season gets set in terms of tag allocations or season dates or whatever. That happens. That's not unique to Wyoming. That can happen anywhere. Um, but is where science and politics can clash more specifically in Wyoming is as it relates to land use. So,
Okay.
for example, um, we Wyoming adopted the first of its kind of migration corridor strategy, where based on a bunch of research and colored animals, where we've documented these really big movements from high mountain country in the summer on summer range of mule deer that may 150 miles away migrate across these sagebrush plains to their crucial winter ranges.
Yeah.
And our governor had the foresight to develop an executive order that actually codifies how we uh, delineate, or well, we use the term designate these migration corridors. But there are some restrictions that go along with having a migration corridor. And I'm not going to go into all the weeds; it'll
Yeah.
bore your listeners. But that can result in changes in land use planning. And so Wyoming, we're all in this together, right? Oil and gas and coal and severance, like the natural resource extraction industry
Mm-hmm.
drives Wyoming's economy
Mm-hmm.
first and foremost. Tourism and wildlife related tourism is the second biggest driver of Wyoming's economy, but it's a distant second.
Yeah.
So if you start having wildlife restrictions that can impact land use, it's just a big deal to the state of Wyoming.
Yeah.
I mean, to our legislature, to our governor, to industry, to families, people with jobs, et cetera. And so while it's easy to sit there and say that we should always just utilize science in the best interest of wildlife, as it pertains to restrictions on development that in land use that can impact the economy, those are all conversations that we have to have
Yeah.
with all the collaborators, and you just not only you can't ignore it, you'd be a fool to even think you should. Like
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
huge driver in Wyoming.
Yeah. Okay. And I don't know why this popped up. It just popped up into my head. Um, are you guys responsible for the wildlife within Yellowstone?
No,
No.
no,
Is that managed by like a different Yellowstone group of people?
just the National Park Service.
Okay, the National Park Service. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. All right, cool. I was just kind of curious of if you
There's,
got
the vast majority of national parks, the state game and fish agencies do not manage wildlife within. There's always some weird exceptions, like the the enabling legislation that created Grand Teton National Park
Mhm.
actually calls for an elk reduction program. So we actually have some influence on harvesting elk within the boundaries of Grand Teton National Park. We certainly coordinate that with the Park Service, but that's it. It doesn't pertain
Yeah.
to any other species. And then in Yellowstone, yeah, there's no hunting
It's
whatsoever. That's all National Park Service.
gotcha. Okay. So, okay. Yeah. So that's the next question would be for the National Park Service. What happens when you have like conflicts around the border of I don't know if has there ever been like a conflict where there's, oh shit, there's too many grizzly bears now in around on private land or public land uh that surround Yellowstone?
Well, that's a huge, huge topic. Yeah, we're working really hard to get, and have for 20 plus years now, to
Yeah.
get grizzly bears delisted. I mean, there's still
Yeah.
a threatened species under the ESA, and so we don't have management authority. That's still resides with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But you know, the bears in the park contribute to the number of bears on the landscape, and so
Hmm.
those are all things that are evaluated with respect to that federal listing decision. But grizzly bears are doing extremely well. They pretty much maxed out all of their available habitat within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in terms of we our grizzly bear folks, our experts there, really strongly feel like we can't really pack too many more bears into that system, and so is
Hmm.
what that's resulted in is bears are now expanding into habitats that they haven't occupied for 100 plus years now, because they're kind of density limited in the areas they already
Yeah.
occupy.
Yeah. I feel that.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
It's a
Cool.
challenge, man.
Yeah.
But and then you couple that with all the subdivision I talked about earlier too that's going on, whether it's Montana, Idaho, or Wyoming, all surrounding Yellowstone on all sides.
Yeah.
So there's more and more conflict with humans and grizzly bears than ever before.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to ask you this one last question before we shut it down. What's the favorite part of your job?
Well, that depends on the part of the career. So, I guess in past hats I've worn, just being out in the country, uh, being able to just spend a day looking for wildlife, documenting where wildlife are, the various different surveys, whether it's, and then some of the research I've been able to be a part of, collar and mountain lions is a highlight,
Hmm.
or a lot of mule deer research, sage grouse research, like that stuff is really, really cool. Now that I've transitioned into the old man that I'm becoming and the administrator, I guess the highlights are different, or the favorite part, and I would say it's just getting to work with a cross section of our folks across the state that are like, I get to supervise our large carnivore program, our science and research unit, three of our regions, and our non-game program. And so it's just to see all the cool stuff that we do collectively as a wildlife agency is pretty awesome. I mean,
Awesome.
we've got our grizzly bear folks are going to be doing some aerial helicopter captures at 12,000 feet in the Absaroka Mountains uh, for grizzly bears this year. To like, that kind of stuff is so cool. Our science unit, all the research that they have going on, or at least provide guidance and advice on the non-game stuff. It's just pretty remarkable. And then you see all the cool cases our game wardens make, or
Yeah.
or all the good projects our habitat biologists come up with. It's pretty neat.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'll tell you this, Justin, man, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on and chat with us about the state of Wyoming and what you do for a living. So thank you very much for your time and good luck with all your research projects moving forward.
You bet, Dan. Glad to be on. Thanks for the invite, and maybe we'll talk again sometime.